Welcome to this special presentation for the Lansing DevOps Meetup. My name is Brendon Thiede, and I'm a DevOps engineer. I get to work with lots of really cool people and lots of really cool technologies. And one that I've been focusing on for the last couple of years is Kubernetes. Now, Kubernetes, if you're not familiar with it, is an orchestration engine for containers. So if you are familiar with Docker at all, you might be familiar with containers, but it's something lighter weight than a VM. And to orchestrate them means that you've got ways to make sure that if you need 3 of a given container running, your orchestration engine will make sure that that's happening. So if something crashes, it'll replace it. Things like that. If one of your nodes, you have multiple VMs maybe running as nodes in your Kubernetes cluster. If one gets overwhelmed, it can move work to a different one. To be able to mess around with that, it's very easy on Linux. It's built with Linux as the target environment, first and foremost. On a Mac, it's fairly straightforward. Windows is a little more difficult. And especially if you throw in some scenarios where maybe you want to not only have Kubernetes, but you want to have a multi-node cluster. That's going to let you do things like trying out anti-affinity rules, like using taints and tolerations, some of these concepts in Kubernetes that can be difficult to test out sometimes. So if you want that, your options are nested virtualization, using something like Linux VM on VirtualBox, where you've got then Docker or Kubernetes on that VM, or maybe multiple Linux VMs. I actually do have a tutorial I put together making a multi-node cluster using multipass, so several Ubuntu VMs. But recently I got turned on to k3d. K3d, it's out of some folks at Rancher who also created K3s. K3s being a way to have a single node Kubernetes cluster by running a single binary. You just run the binary and you've got your Kubernetes. K3d lets you it runs the same thing behind the scenes, but it allows you to have a multi-node cluster. So you can actually have as many nodes as you want. But instead of doing it inside of VMs, it's actually doing it in Docker. So you've got containers in Docker that act as your different nodes in your cluster. So it makes it much lighter weight and much easier to set up. But to set it up, you're going to need some prerequisites. I'm going to walk you through what I have here. And this is out on my website, Digestible DevOps. There's a K3d on Windows tutorial. And what we're going to start off by doing is enabling WSL2. Now, it's been within about, I think within the last year, WSL2 is available for Windows Home, meaning that you can run Docker Desktop now on Windows Home. That's something prior to that point you couldn't do, which meant that it was going to be a very different experience for Windows Home versus Windows Professional. But now, as long as you're up to date with all your patches and such, you should be able to follow these instructions, whether you're on Windows Home or Windows Pro or any other flavor. So first things first, and I'm just going to kind of talk through some of these because I've already done them myself, so it's not going to be as effective to demonstrate, but for the most part, you're just going to copy and paste these commands. So you're just going to be able to start up PowerShell as administrator, and you're going to enable the Windows subsystem for Linux. By executing these couple commands, it's going to enable the features you need. You're going to have to reboot your computer. After you reboot, you can follow the link here. You're going to get this WSL2 Linux kernel update. You're going to install that, and then you can open up another administrative PowerShell instance. And what we're going to do is just set the default WSL version to 2. If you have a reason to not do that, I guess it's up to you. I honestly have no reason to want to use multiple versions of WSL, so I just have it set default to 2. And then you need to go ahead and get a distribution. Now, if you go to the Microsoft Store, you're going to have several options here. So it's really up to you if you feel comfortable with one or another. Lately, I've defaulted to Ubuntu a lot. It's very popular. And also, there are certain things that Windows has done to make Ubuntu specifically work a little better. So I would recommend, if you don't have any reason to pick something in particular, just go with Ubuntu 20.04. That's the LTS, the latest version. And I have been in this situation before where I was using a work laptop where the Microsoft Store was blocked. If that is the case, there are instructions you can follow to do things without the store, where you basically download the ISO, or actually I forget the format exactly that it is, but you grab that manually and you can still get to it. But with that all up and running, you can now install Docker Desktop. With Docker Desktop, it's going to ask you if you want to install the WSL2 components. It should automatically recognize that you have those. And so that option should be selected by default. So just go ahead and allow that to happen. And then go ahead and reboot. And this is just a personal thing. If you don't use Docker all the time, and especially if you're not going to be plugged in all the time, it's probably in your best interest to not have Docker start with Windows. And you can see that here. I'll show you real quick. If you go to your Docker settings, there's just this start Docker desktop when you log in. You can just uncheck that. I'm going to leave it checked because I do use it a fair amount, and I'm pretty much always plugged in my current context. So, but that's just a quick way to save some battery if you don't need it. And so now installing k3d, technically all you need to do is download a binary and you're good to go. But in order to make upgrading easier, to make setting your path easier, all that stuff, what I'm recommending here is that you would install Chocolatey. Chocolatey, if you've used Homebrew for Mac, or if you've even used apt or yum or another package manager, Chocolatey is along the same lines. So this little line here, if you just pop this into an admin PowerShell console, it will install Chocolatey from their website. And you can follow the link there if you're unsure as to what that script's going to do. But once you've got Chocolatey installed, I would go ahead, close your PowerShell window, open a new one, another admin one, and then you can just run choco install, or there's actually cinst is a shorthand for that, but you're going to install k3d. And then just because pretty much any Kubernetes documentation you run into, you're going to see reference to JQ. YQ is another thing. They're just for parsing JSON and YAML. It's very useful when you're doing basically streams, pipelines in the shell where you want to pass one thing to the next, but you want to manipulate things here and there or grab specific values out. And then Helm is something that's very useful for dealing with Kubernetes. So all of those are installed. Now for Windows, what you can do is you can go ahead and paste in these commands, and actually you should do this just in your regular user shell. That'd be fine. It doesn't have to be the admin one. And this is going to set up tab completion. So that's so that when you come into your shell, if I do k3d, I can actually double tab here, and it goes through the different options that I have. And then it gives me context for, I said cluster, and so now it gives me, oh, these are the things that I can do for cluster. So that's what that's doing. Now, you've got k3d there, and all it is, just that one binary. We can now create a cluster. this command here, this k3d cluster create, and I just gave it a name of local k3s, that's going to very simply create a single node cluster. That's not that exciting to us. Instead, what I want to do, I'm going to kind of speed ahead for a little bit of brevity here. I'm going to actually go ahead and get this going. So I'm going to copy this command, this cluster create local k8s, and I'm going to go ahead and get this going because it is going to take a little bit of time to do this. But what I've done is I've told it how many servers and how many agents. So these servers, that 3, that represents the control plane. So within Kubernetes, you've got an API server, you've got your controller manager, and then you've got your agents that are going to be able to handle your actual workloads. Now, as I mentioned, K3S actually combines some of those things into like a single binary. So it's going to look a little different than a typical production Kubernetes cluster, but you know, it's going to behave very, very similarly. And then I also exposed some ports here. So I have 8888 is going to be routed to this special load balancer container. And it's going to be on port 80, and then 8889 is going to be 443. So that's going to allow me, when I deploy, web applications, I can actually hit them in my local browser. And we're going to leave that kind of baking for a little bit. Now you'll see I've got this funky command here where I'm saying if there's a path of, .cube/config.k3d star, move it. Well, that's because Kubernetes, when you use the kubectl, kube control, sometimes people call it kubectl. When you use the kube control command, it's one of the places that it will look for configuration is in your home directory in a folder of .cube/config. For some reason, the very first time I ran k3d, it created a config.k3d with some kind of semi-random string following it. It created that file, but it didn't copy it to the right location, so it didn't actually move it. I don't know why that was, but if you run this, it'll take care of it if it runs into it. But by default, it's actually not going to replace your kubeconfig file that's already there. It's going to append a new context to it. But I don't have any other context here, so it's not going to matter one way or the other. But that's just something to be aware of if you run into that situation. And look, it is all done. So now we can, here, I'll show you real quick. If I look at that kubeconfig, you'll see that it's, this is very normal looking for a kubeconfig file. It's got the cluster that it's going to connect to, which it prefixed my name of local k3s with k3d. But the server, it's not the normal port. It's not that normal 6443. It's looking at this port 53265. That's a little interesting. Well, that's because we're not connecting directly to this cluster. We are connecting through Docker. So if we look at our containers that Docker is listing, we'll see right here that it's taking 53265 and it's redirecting that to 6443. And this port may be different depending on how you're running. It's not going to matter because it's all going to be kind of transparent to you. You can also see those other port forwards that we defined, the 8888 and the 8889. You can even, K3d has the ability for you to do volume mounts. And if you look up, how to do a bind mount for Docker, it looks very much the same. Although you can actually tell it, if you want to mount to every agent, for example, every server, or just a separate mount for each, you could define those. Eventually, though, you'd probably get to a point where you'd have so much configuration that you don't want to keep tacking that all onto your command line like this. So in that case, probably what you would want to do is create a config YAML file and pass the config that way. And you can version that, with your repo and such. That'd be little cleaner probably. But while we're here, so we see this is the kind of the real containers that are representing the nodes. But we can also look at what's running in our cluster. So right now we've got in the kube system, you've got core DNS. It installed traffic as the ingress controller. It's a little different in some ways than, for example, the Nginx ingress controller, which is kind of the more default. But as long as you stick with the standard APIs, it'll look and feel the same. But yeah, so that's our cluster up and running. So we'll jump back over here, and what we can do is we can now go ahead and deploy a workload. This is a rather hideous string, but what this is doing is it's creating inline YAML, multiple stanzas of YAML. So that's what these triple dashes are, is they're separating different objects. But all of this, if we keep going, what we're going to be able to do is have that all get redirected or piped to this kube control apply. And kube control apply is a declarative way to create objects inside of Kubernetes. And because the echo command is an alias to write output in PowerShell, we can actually run this same exact command in Bash. But we'll go ahead, we'll let it do that, and we'll see created. And I'm probably too slow, but if we look at our pods, we can see a couple are creating still. So in my replicas, I said I wanted 3 copies of the API with 1 copy of the UI, and now they're all done. And if you recall, we said we were going to take, except it's not HTTPS, it's HTTP. We said we were going to take localhost 8888, and here we are. Very, very simple proof of concept here, but showing that we can get from our local machine to our running cluster, which actually is another one of those things that can get very tricky. If you're doing like nested virtualization or anything involving VMs, where you've got that extra hop of something to route your traffic through. But with K3d, super, super simple. Now, everything I've done so far, I did with PowerShell. However, Bash is, you're going to see much more examples running Bash. You're going to see, even certain tools are only going to run on Linux. So with WSL2, you've got a Bash shell. So what we can do is, I hit my little drop down here, I create a new Bash instance. And in case you're wondering why things look the way they do, if you're not familiar with it, this is Windows Terminal. So you can actually install this from the Windows Store, and it allows you to have multiple different options for what type of shell you want to load. So I default to PowerShell 7, but I can also tell it I want to create an Ubuntu shell. And I've actually already gone through all the things that I've laid out here. But what I did here is tried to make it as simple as possible to have a consistent experience between PowerShell and Bash. So first things first, I want those same shell completions. But the shell completions, if you've ever done your own within Bash, you'll know that it's based on the name of the command. And the name of the command that it expects for the Bash shell completions is not k3d.exe, it's k3d. So that's why what I'm doing here is I'm saying we need to have an alias of k3d for k3d.exe. And these scripts, if you just copy and paste this into your shell as your user, you'll be just fine. And just to show that it will not break anything, you can run these multiple times. That's why you see it's got the grep. So this is just kind of a recommendation that I have for making your scripts rerunnable. It's very simple to just say grep for the thing that you want to make sure is there. And then this double pipe there, that's essentially an OR, like an XOR. So if this fails, so grep, if you grep and a match is not found, it'll give an exit code of 1. And so that means it's going to go ahead and do this. So if it's not in there, it's going to just put in a little bit of output saying, yep, here's a comment, and then here's this alias, putting that in your .bashrc file. And your .bashrc file is going to get run every time you start up a shell. And then sourcing that is also going to actually load it for the current session. So that's why that's there. So if you're not familiar with Bash scripts, I'm trying to give you examples of what I at least consider best practices. And we want some other shell completions too. So kube control, it's actually already there. So I don't have to do any alias for kube control, because you can actually see, this is kind of interesting, but if I look at kube control, it's at user local bin kube control. But I can also look at kube control exe, which is in my Windows file system. Now, I didn't see this happen, but I'm pretty darn sure that this came from Docker Desktop. Docker Desktop, when it knew that it needed to install those WSL2 components, I think that's when that got set up, which is pretty cool. Now you can use kube control exe. I'll show you real quick. Like I can do that. It's going to look exactly the same. So you can see, looks the same if I do exe or without the exe. But either way, I want some shell completion. So I'm having it do this inline sourcing. So the kube control completion bash will actually spit out what it needs to be able to do that. So having it source the output of that every time I load my shell is going to make sure that, you know, whenever I update my kube control version or anything like that, it's going to grab the latest completions and have that there. Helm, same thing, except here I need to do that, you know, create my alias, you know, grab those completions, good to go. And then this is a personal preference thing, but if you're following along with any of my tutorials, this is something that, you know, you should probably do, because I'm going to reference this a lot. I like to, when I'm inside of my bash shell, I like to be able to reference my Windows home. And so I create an environment variable WinHome, because they're going to be different. You know, my home for my user in this Ubuntu instance, the home directory is /user or /home/bthiede, versus my Windows home is /mnt/c users thied, because, you know, wanted to save some letters there. But so what we're doing is we're actually, and this is something I just learned, so I think it's clever. You can choose to disagree if you like, but what you can actually do is you can wrap the output of calling cmd.exe inside of your bash. So what I'm doing here is I'm throwing into my bashrc a command to say export winhome equals the output of this command. And this command is going to just call into Windows to grab the user profile variable. And then it's trimming off, you know, it's doing a carriage return there. Linux doesn't like that so much. So trimming that off and then doing a little bit of manipulation of that, because it's going to be, you know, a capital C : you know, /, you know, whatever. I need to change that into the Linux friendly way. So that's how I end up doing that. And then what I'm going to do is create a link between winhome.cube and my home directory .cube here in my bash shell. So if I do, so now I am in my home directory. So if I do an ls -l, LA, I've got .cube is /mnt/c/users/the.cube. So it's actually looking at that file in my Windows file system, so that when I'm messing around with things in PowerShell or I'm messing around in things in Bash, it's still going to be the same cluster that it's connected to. And yeah, and I already did the big reveal. I can do get all namespaces, and hey, it did my autocomplete as I expected. And there we go. We've got all this stuff. And if I, if I downloaded a different kube config for a different cluster, you'd see it affected instantly in both places. And I guess just to show real quick, for the curious, the bash RC, if I look at the very end, so this is what I added in at the end, is everything here from this k3d setup down. So it's just a couple of aliases, some sourcing of, for bash completion, and then my export of WinHome. And that is all that I have. So thank you for joining me, and hopefully you'll come back for some of the upcoming demonstrations that I'm going to have. I showed how to install some resources, some objects into the cluster. There was a lot going on there, but in the next few videos, I'm going to show some pretty cool tools for how to make that a lot easier. So come back and I'll see you then.